All right, calling to order the policy meeting for February 20th at 3:33 p.m. On our agenda, we have two pieces. Did you want to tackle the social media within the calendar conversation still, or do you want to completely pull them apart?
I'll do that first.
First, perfect. Then let's talk social media policy. And you have a hard copy of it here for you.
Yeah, okay.
For anyone who is looking on board docs at home, it was recently loaded, so you might need to hit refresh on your board docs in order to access these
So
documents.
this was loaded within a half hour,
Just recently.
because I copied the earlier.
Hello, I'm Ann Fullerton. I'm the Communications Director, and I just want to go over some of our questions for the committee about moving forward with the social media policy. The reason that it was sort of rolled into the conversation about the calendar is that before we can actually schedule it with you, we need some direction on how best to move forward. And that's largely because, make sure I push the right thing here. Okay, what do I push?
You say next slide, please, and it
there we go.
magically happens.
There we go, got it. So social media is a pretty broad topic. Unlike many technologies, it's both a technical tool and a content source. It's used both to share information, but also to create information. It's used by individuals, but also by entities. And for individuals, it's used both for personal reasons and professionally. So given that breadth, it seems to touch a lot of different policy areas, and the scope could be quite broad. So at present, it is actually included already in several policies. In some cases, the policy is fairly old, so that the phrasing may be a little dated, but the substance is there. For example, EGD, the Internet Safety and Acceptable Use of Technology, does include details about Web 2.0, it's described as, and talks about employees using professional behavior and professional language. It talks about keeping out content that's defamatory or obscene. So there is an aspect of the content creation part of social media in that policy. In GBEBB, there is discussion about having inappropriate content, contact with students through social media platforms as well as via email or other technologies. The student journalists policy, which is fairly new, talks about students publishing on social media. And the bullying policy talks about cyberbullying and social media use to conduct cyberbullying as well.
Commissioner Badima has a question.
Yeah.
Real quick, you calling out all these acronyms, these.
Oh, sorry, they're the policy names. I'm sorry, Commissioner Badima.
Oh, they're on the next page.
Yep.
Oh, the
Yeah.
next page, oh, okay.
Yep,
I'm still on the,
And
yeah.
also,
Okay, thanks.
when the district first launched its own social media accounts, the Twitter account was first, and then Facebook and Instagram followed. We did, in consultation with the legal office, develop guidance for social media use in an official capacity for both schools and districts. So that didn't come through the policy committee, but there is a document that guides both the district office staff and school staff in what's appropriate for an official presence on social media for the school as an entity or for the district. And we also have, as almost all social media platforms do, we have a customer use policy or guidelines that are attached to both Twitter and Facebook to guide what sort of commenting is acceptable, and the circumstances with Facebook anyway, and also Instagram, I guess, when we would delete or hide a post from somebody on the outside world, if it's defamatory, if it's obscene, and so forth and so on. So those things all exist. What is not covered currently are these items. We don't talk about the circumstances under which social media could be used in instruction. And anecdotally, we know that some teachers are. They may do a project that involves Instagram. They may do a project that involves a closed Facebook group. So what needs to be in place for that to occur? For example, do parents need to agree if a student is going to have an account, a social media account, to do a school assignment, that sort of thing? We do not have clarity about, in any of the documents that I'm aware of, about when it's acceptable to post a picture of a child or the creative work of a child on social media broadly. It is included in our opt-out form that students get at the beginning of the year. We do explicitly say that parents must opt their children out of being depicted on an official school or district social media platform, but it doesn't cover a teacher taking a picture of a child or a child's work and posting that on their personal account. And we don't have clarity about personal and professional accounts. We have a lot of teachers who mix the two. We have some teachers or staff who keep two separate accounts, one for their personal interactions and one for professional. I'm sure there are other things that are omitted. These are the ones that we hear about most often and that I'm aware of are being discussed in other districts. But because of the breadth of social media use, I didn't want to suggest that that was everything that could possibly be included, because I'm sure there are other things that could be addressed as well. In looking at what other LEAs are doing, like us, they're pretty much all over the place. Some have, I guess Baltimore County is closest to us. They touch on social media in their acceptable use policy, in their employee conduct policy, also in their bullying, and almost all the districts have something about cyberbullying in their bullying, harassment, or intimidation policies. Some go a little bit further. PG has an actual policy about use of social media as distinct from other technologies as part of an administrative procedure, although it's not a policy per se. And Howard County has a pretty up-to-date acceptable use policy that goes into more detail about social media than we currently do on ours. But again, this is just a sampling. There are some LEAs that seem to have nothing at all about social media, but by and large, I would say that most of them are doing what we're doing and incorporating it to some extent in other policies. There's a further wrinkle in that a couple of weeks ago, we learned about some legislation that's been introduced in Annapolis called the Public Schools Social Media Use by Educators Bill. It is coming up for hearing on March 7th. And what it has directed, if it moves forward, is that MSDE is to develop a model policy. It actually has a pretty good breadth in terms of talking about use of social media in the classroom, about distinguishing between personal and professional use. It's pretty comprehensive. Our understanding is that this is not a high priority for the legislative session, so it's hard to know whether it's going to move forward or not. But it is out there. And should that move forward, the requirement would be that districts would have to develop a policy based on whatever model policy the state develops. So at present, it's a little unknown as to whether we'll need to move forward to conform to that. So the real question that we have for the committee is how we should move forward. These are some options. We could revise existing policies to address these issues more comprehensively. We could create a new policy, although it would then overlap with some existing policies. We could do some mixture of the two. And really, to move forward most effectively and efficiently, we need some further direction from you in the context of potentially needing to hold to see how this legislation moves forward in Annapolis. So that's where we are.
Committee members?
No, I just find this really interesting how you talked about it, is, different policies incorporate pieces of the social media. I think that's interesting. And because of that, it would seem to me there would have to be a lot of discussion and an open discussion with the board and maybe others to put all of that together, because you covered a whole lot in that. So I think that we need to find a date or a time to do that. I don't think that the people here on this committee we can have a discussion, but it's a big door to open, you know.
Well, I agree with Commissioner Bondima that it's a big area, and it's huge, really, and defining. So, yes, I feel like I need more time to discuss and talk about it, and I don't know if I don't think I should say more at this point, but yeah.
So where I'm sitting on this just right now, having not spoken informally with my colleagues, is I think that slide 3 really exposes why we have to have a policy. If I'm a parent, if I'm a community member, and I'm looking for a social media policy, I'm going to go search Baltimore City Schools social media policy. I am not necessarily going to be policy savvy enough to look for GBEE, BBB. And especially because this is a policy that will impact students on a more immediate level. My gut is that we need a policy that is very clear, but I also think we have an amazing opportunity with this policy in that students are engaged in this. Students do have a vested immediate interest, so I think that we could work with academics, work through the social studies teachers, get kids involved in a district-wide kind of way within the standards and curriculum to hear their input and help them understand how policy is developed and how it is implemented. And I know that my colleagues here are very interested in trying to get closer to students and get with, so I'm sure that we would be able to do that without having to use a lot of other staff time, because you all are plenty busy. So my gut, without talking to the group, is that we definitely need to move forward, but that I think it would be a really beautiful opportunity to move forward with student voice first, get all of their brainstorming ideas, local partner ideas, and then bring that back to staff and say, okay, now let's start from here. By then, we also will have gone through the legislative, at least the first testimony. And what I'm hearing about this is that it's going to most likely be deferred for local control, so that it won't actually probably be an issue. But MSD may have, it may be enough for them to say, you know what, this would be a good idea for us to do anyway.
Right.
But I don't think, for me, it's not prohibitive of us moving forward.
Okay.
Can I make
So,
one more
yeah,
statement?
absolutely.
I really want to make another statement, too. And looking at all the activity that's going on around the country in reference to social media and the issues that's related to social media, and talking about positives and negative activities coming from way up at the top, like from the president down to the average person. Again, what our commissioners have said, and when you say all of that, I'm in total agreement that this could be pretty big, and it might not just be local. You know, it might be across the state of Maryland, because things are happening fast, and it's all related to social media. So we might put a lot of emphasis on it and get a lot of attention for what we're going to try to do.
Mhm.
That's it. Thank you.
On slide 3, and thank you for the presentation, but are these the current policies that we're using to help draft a policy?
We would have to, they would have to be taken into consideration, certainly, so that there would be nothing contradictory between what exists in policy and what might be developed in a new policy. There are aspects of it that are perfectly reasonable that I would think would carry over. I mean, you know, we clearly need to have something about cyberbullying. We clearly need to have something about, you know, not using obscene language, that sort of thing. I would say, though, that they all touch on social media, but none of those policies is particularly comprehensive.
Mhm.
Right.
Thank you, and I would also hope that we can frame this not just in the what we shouldn't do and how we can't move forward, because frankly, we'll never figure out all the ways that kids will figure out and teachers will figure out to do things that we don't want them to do.
Right.
But really use it as a proactive guidance tool, starting with the webpage, all the way through individual reach out and contact. So, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for making the time to make this happen for us. Moving on, we have, it's the $1 million meeting with all the suits in the house. Calendar time, who is leading that discussion for us? Sweet, thanks, Joe.
Hi, everyone. Joe Strake, Board Liaison. I'd like to thank all the chiefs for being here and the committee for being here as well. So the purpose of this is for an initial discussion about our SY 18-19 Policy Committee calendar. So we're hoping to have a good discussion of things that we would like to see be discussed for next year's calendar. So this is the agenda of the presentation. One, I've already done some preliminary discussions with chiefs regarding policies that they want to see added to the agenda for next year. The first thing we're going to talk about are policies that were on the calendar but were postponed and what kind of the future is for them. The second thing that we're going to do is some questions bubbled up when I talked to some chiefs about how we want to move forward with the policy committee in particular. And then the next one is what I started this slide with, is policies that we plan on discussing for next year. All right, so first, the postponed policies. The first one is the charter lease policy, which was not initially on the slate when we agreed to the calendar last year. It was added and then removed. So where that stands is we're currently thinking about adding that language to an existing policy rather than creating a new policy. So by the time we come back in a few months to approve the calendar for next year, we hope to have an answer regarding that, whether this will be on the calendar for next year as a new policy or whether it will be on the calendar to edit an existing policy. But one way or another, we anticipate that we'll bring it forward for the policy committee calendar next year. The second one is the equity policy. So I know that there's been a lot of discussion regarding whether we need a standalone policy, whether there's going to be the inclusion of a statement. This is a board policy initiative from my understanding, so that one is to be determined. The next one is JBB, sex and gender-based discrimination. So a lot of research locally to see what other LEAs are doing, as well as nationally what other jurisdictions are doing. We've had some discussions and we plan on continuing to have discussions, but we envision that this will be on the agenda for the next school year. And lastly, the social media policy, which we just talked about. So we're looking on for student input on that, and hopefully that will be on the calendar for next year pending what the determination is made during those discussions.
Commissioner Bondima?
Okay, thank you. But just because we're on the air and some of this information is here and some, I remember some of this, but it's a place where I can go to get all of this, look at this policy. Yeah, it's all there. And how can people review that? Because when we talk about, we put it on the screen, we have people who are viewing this. Can we tell them how they can review it with us in case they want to have a discussion or come in and spend 3 minutes talking about it, answer questions? We might understand.
I'm going to
Do you
attempt to answer your question. If I miss it, please let me know. But on board docs, there's the policy matrix, which is housed by the board office, so that they do all the updating when something is postponed and it's rescheduled. It's called the policy matrix, and it's available on board docs. It's public
And the
facing.
public can look at it as
Yeah.
well.
The public can
And Joe,
look
if I
at
can
it.
add to that, the public can also go there to search any of our policies.
Right,
So
okay.
the matrix is the policies that are under construction and review, but every single board policy is there.
Okay,
and
I know it, but I
yeah,
just like
yep,
us to repeat
exactly,
it.
yeah.
So our
So that
community
you can
know
find it
that.
either by searching JBB or by searching sex and gender-based discrimination.
thank
So
you.
either way will search work.
And then also, to give a little sneak peek of a later slide, also on board docs are our board rules, which were the precursor to the board policies. So you just need to switch the cursor from board policies, which is the default, to board rules, which we're slowly in the process of changing over board rules to board policy. So those are all available publicly on board docs.
Thank you, I appreciate that, because, sometimes people are looking at and listening and not jotting down, but at least they know where they can go to get that information. We might know, but some people might not know. But thank
And-
you very much.
And anytime anyone who has a question on where to find something, they could reach out to the board office and they'll reach out to me, or vice versa. We'll find it and we'll get it to them. So
Thank
that's
you.
not a problem.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
And Joe, just one more piece to add
Sure.
before we leave slide 3. For people that have been waiting and wondering about whether we're doing an equity policy or an equity statement, had conversation today with the chair, the board chair, as well as with Dr. Santelises, and we're going to open it up to public input to generate ideas, just sort of a giant brainstorming session with no promises that anything's going to end up, but to get language from the community. And we're looking to schedule that meeting sometime in July or August. Right now, the board calendar and staff calendar is far too overwhelmed to add anything, but we are moving forward, and part of that conversation will be policy or statement.
Great, thank you. And in addition to that, something that I realized that I left out on the slide will follow that, which was there was a discussion about a school climate policy, which we will wait on the decision on the equity policy to inform the climate policy. All right, discussion points. So number 1, a question has come up, and I'm hoping to get some clarity on it. As I said earlier, we're in the process of trying to convert our board rules into policies. However, not all board rules seemingly need to become policies because they're outdated or they are, no longer the direction of the board and staff. So the question then becomes, do we need a policy on removing board rules, and how should we approach that? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we'll get into the practical aspect of that, but I was kind of also actually asking for direction as whether that should be something that we talk about, but we can table that for later on in
Yeah,
the
that might be a
presentation.
better work session,
Okay.
perhaps, and not necessarily a full forum work session, but to sit down and really look at, okay, a quick analysis of what kind of buckets of rules do we have, and could they be merged, and could they be guidance documents rather than rules, or what needs to go away and is antiquated? And honestly, I haven't gone in and dug through those
Okay.
to know, but you and I could sit down, or we can
Okay.
figure that out.
And then the second discussion point is something that we haven't done in years past, but we think is a good move moving forward, is to leave some flexibility on the front and back end of the policy calendar to accommodate for any legislation that gets passed. So this way, we don't have a full slate of 12 months, and then we realize we need to create or change a policy, and then it becomes a game of Tetris of where we're going to move something. So once we bring the calendar to you in a few months for approval, there are going to be open slots, and it's not because we've run out of ideas or we don't think that things need to get done, but it's more so to keep space open for legislation that's going to require policy change.
I think that's exactly what my mission was in getting the legislative platform to be brought to policy as a committee, so we can house those. We can also then use that time to respond to legislation, to figure out what, to guide and direct the chair in what the policy committee response to proposed legislation will be. So strongly in favor of that.
I just want to say I totally agree, because there's so many things happening in Annapolis. I was out there today, and it said they're overwhelmed with all kinds of bills, so we just never know what might pop up. Before we have this discussion, at least we can find out what's going on there, and then bring it back, and so we can have it see what's going on while we're having the discussion, and then look at what's going on after this discussion, so we can be on track. So I think it's
Absolutely.
a great idea. Yeah, thank you.
So at this point, I don't know if I have the power or ability to do this, but if the chiefs could come up to the table so we can have discussion if needed.
I knight ye, Joe, with the power to invite whomever you want to the table.
Thank you. So if the the chiefs want to take a seat up here so we could have discussion on mic if needed.
And if necessary, we can, it'll look funny on the camera, but we can seat people here so that everyone has a mic.
Yeah.
So we can. Like to the table, like all the way up, invited like real guests. And understanding how busy you all are, really appreciate you taking your time to be here. This is.
So a quick rundown of how this list came to be. This list was created in part by former board office member Leah Amelga as far as what board rules were due for change. So that was also merged with a list of items that chiefs have suggested to be brought forward for this upcoming year. So you'll see at the top, obviously, this one became a priority based on this past winter. So that's the delayed openings and emergency closings of schools. That will absolutely be on the agenda for next year. We've got a lot of calls from the community, and we heard them, and that's why that is number one intentionally. We're absolutely going to have that revisited. The second one is an attendance policy, which was suggested by the chief academic officer. The third was a procurement policy review, and the fourth is the test integrity policy, which is a current policy, and the chief achievement and accountability officer suggested that that be revisited. The rest of the policies that you'll see up there are proposed board rule revisions. So if there's, between the policies that we discussed that were postponed to be on the calendar for next year and these policies that are under consideration, now would be a great time for anyone to add or subtract anything that they believe should be revisited or created or changed.
So these were, you all decided to include these based on the board rules. So you all looked through the board rules and decided that these would be the recommendations for policy considerations next year.
So yeah, the board office, Leah Amelga, who used to be in the board office, would every year would come up with policies that needed to be revised the following year. So she has since transitioned out, but this is her last list of things that, based on the years, need to be revisited. So that's where anything that says board rule in parentheses is something that was due, so to speak, to be revised. Yes, Marianne.
Okay. Yes. Isn't it the intent that all board rules will be replaced by board policies? That's my understanding, so that some of these things, it's not that we looked at them and said, this needs to be revised now. It's just part of our ongoing process to replace all board rules with board policies. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right, and that was why earlier, there are some that we may feel that we don't need anymore, so we need to figure out the process to not convert, but maybe remove board rules.
So my question to you is, if we look at this as in sort of reference and frame, while the policy is the long-term vision, sets sort of the bare minimum bar kind of pieces, as we look at the blueprint, as you look at your HC needs, as you look at academic needs and facilities needs, are there pieces missing here that, if they were institutionalized, would help you be more efficient and effective and able to do your job better? Because ultimately, we would like the policy committee to not just be extra work for staff and be something that really supports the direction, trajectory that we're trying to go for student outcomes. Jeff, would you pass him a mic, please? John, thank you.
So to your question, the state of Maryland recently revised the procurement limits and raised them from $25,000 to $50,000 per contract expenditure. So that's something that we would bring before the board and ask them to consider. And certainly that would go to your point of providing some additional flexibility for the organization to operate more efficiently and effectively.
And that's what's referenced under bullet 3, correct? Procurement policy review? Perfect. Anything else for anybody that's not there that you would like us to consider? Hey, you know, this is your chance to step out of line and be like, oh, wait, can we please get this one in? And not that it's possible. We're really full, and you're really full, and you know that.
I have a question.
Just want to be sure we're responsive to supporting your needs. Okay, Commissioner Bondino?
No, I have basically the same question. This whole set of policies that's under consideration has been reviewed, and most of them either out of date, need to be updated, or will make our institution better. Is that why we're doing this? It's been heavily reviewed, and it means that maybe we came to a conclusion that it shouldn't have been a policy, or is pieces in there that should be removed, or pieces that should be added. It's been totally reviewed. Is that what we're here for?
So the first 4 bullets are ones that chiefs have said need to be created or edited. The rest of them are, as Marianne alluded to, are board rules that need to be converted to policy based on the direction of the board, where we're completely changing all of former board rules into board policy. So this is just a list of board rules that it's their turn, if you will, to be turned into policy.
Another question, what is the oldest policy in this? Because what I find in some institutions, or in some of the places, the policies are so old, they just need to be updated, and they were approved from previous board members, and things need to be changed. That's where we're at, right?
So, if I may, many of the board rules have not been revisited since around 1987
Right,
to 89. There was a comprehensive list created, and I believe it was by Carrie, who was Dr. Alonzo's secretary, that cross-referenced all of the board rules with all of the board policies. And as you know, we are now using the National School Board Association's indexing system. So we went through and looked at the language to see if, by way of example, GBM mirrored what, and that's temporary employees, mirrored what should be in that policy, whether we could adopt it wholesale or whether there would need to be a revision. So I don't know where that list is now, but it exists. To the extent that board rules are still on the books, then they are the board policy. They're just called differently. So where this board does not want to continue to abide by that language, there needs to be a revisiting of the rule, and it would either need to be rescinded or modified. And I guess in part that is what this list does. But there is a whole different indexing system that my colleagues may also want to look at to see some of the other subject matters that are addressed in policies throughout the country, and then make a determination as to how you all want to proceed.
Just let me say something. I've done this when I was at the higher education. It's done everywhere. What you're doing is not unusual. Everybody it should be done every certain amount of years. To have policies that exist from the 80s is ridiculous. So it should be standard that I don't know, you would decide how many years, but everybody should be reviewing board policies every 2, 3, 4 years. And that's just a part of the system. So this is kind of normal. So I don't see anything wrong with doing it this way. Because you might end up with something that's identical, but laws change and activities change. I mean, we're going through that right now to save time. This should be done,
And we do have most of the policies, and I should announce to the public, we have new members to our policy committee starting today, and welcome and appreciate your voices and participation. That we do actually have a matrix, and most policies we've approved lately have here's when we'll get an annual review, whether it'll be written, whether it'll be to the whole board or the policy committee, or every other year.
Right.
So that's been written in as we convert these to when the updates and reviews are going to be given.
And for what I've seen of the ones that we've been doing since I've been here a year and a half. Am I still new? Anyway, okay, a year
No,
and a
he's
half.
new now.
Okay, a year and a half. The ones that we've been doing is mostly emergency ones. Well, not when I say emergency, I mean things that need to be handled now. Things that's going on, and maybe the legislature has changed, or something that we need to address early? Or,
Well, we try to prioritize them based on what's going on,
Right.
but there's a calendar that's laid out. So
Right.
we have this, we've looked at all the board rules, so we have, so we've looked at, and we've kind of prioritized which ones we need to do first, if there's some timely issue,
and
reason
that's
why.
exactly what I'm saying. You frowned when I said that, but what you just said is exactly what I mean.
But I guess I just wouldn't characterize it as an emergency necessarily.
Well, sometimes it might be, but it's not a bad thing to be emergency. When I say it's something that needs to occur today or not let it wait on the side. Maybe I use the emergency too often. Maybe I need to say something that needs to be addressed
Urgency.
urgent. Oh, right, okay, not emergency. We're not going to collapse because of it's not being in place. But I think that what you're doing is exactly where you should be, and just put a time on how often we do it and just review and bring these policies up to date. And some of them might end up being the same. You never know, and some may change according to laws and legislature, whatever. But I think it's an excellent idea, and I'm impressed with the fact that you all lined up, and it looks like we're in Congress somewhere with all these suits in here. So it's really interesting. But thank you.
Any other points, commissioners? Anything else from the floor, from anybody? To me, this looks like a very robust and ambitious agenda. So, as we have learned, and I think if there's any committee that represents flexibility, it's going to be this one, as times change and tides change and urgent needs emerge. But I appreciate the effort and time you've all taken to come up with this list, and I think we can go ahead and get them scheduled in.
Thank you.
Anything else for we don't have any public testimony today, correct? Because we get that adventure later. All right. In that case, then, at 4:10 p.m., the policy meeting is adjourned.